and maybe we're close. We're getting words that things are going okay in Russia, and it doesn't mean anything until we hear what the final outcome is. But they have very serious discussions going on right now with President Putin and others, and hopefully they all want to end this nightmare. It's a nightmare. It's a horrible thing when you look.
Okay, so that was from the White House. That was literally just minutes ago before we came on the air here. President Trump went on the air and said that his negotiating teams are in Russia. They're communicating with them, that Putin, he says, has conceptually agreed, I think in principle is the term they used, to a 30-day ceasefire. But the devil's in the details, as we've said. Now, we've been showing you for months how Russia has been adamant that there wouldn't be a ceasefire, that they're willing to negotiate, but they're not going to do a ceasefire because they said that would only benefit the Ukraine side. But they wanted a long-term end to this. They wanted to negotiate while still fighting, and that's what they were willing to do. Yesterday, in fact, you see that on the screen right there, Putin in fatigues. We're going to talk about that more in a little bit here. I think the first time we've seen him in military uniform since the war started. So that's kind of noteworthy by itself. But he was down there talking with Valery Gerasimov, who is the chief of staff of the armed forces of Russia, in near the Kursk area. And we'll talk about what's been going on there as well. But he said a number of things in that conversation yesterday. But before I get to what he said yesterday, I want to get to what he said earlier today. He had a press conference with the leader of Belarus, Lukashenko, and in it he was asked specifically about this request for a 30-day ceasefire.
We understand that there are activities aimed at reducing loss of human life in the conflict. Secondly, we agree with the proposals for the ceasefire, but our position is based on the assumption that the ceasefire would lead to a long-term peace, something that would remove the initial reasons for the crisis.
So there's some big caveats. The way it's being shown in the Russian press is he agrees to the concept of a 30-day ceasefire, quote, with nuances, end quote. We keep hearing that a lot. And then the question are, what are those nuances? Some of which he mentioned right there, which is the root causes have to be addressed. That mirrors what Sergei Lavrov has continuously said. We showed a clip of him yesterday saying that from back in December. They've said nothing besides that it has to be something that eliminates the war, not just stops the fighting. That's something that Russia said they were not interested in. And that is potentially telling, because for the Russian side, what has caused the war, the roots of this conflict, go back to NATO trying to come into NATO trying to come into Ukraine, the ability for the Ukraine side to have a large military, and of course, having all of that right up on the Russian border. And that's one of the things they were completely against. And of course, going back even to the Minsk agreements before that, it was the effective civil war that had been going on in Ukraine since 2014, which included a lot of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers that the Russian side had been supporting for the whole thing. So to them, all of that has to get resolved. That has to be part of this. Now, what is not clear, what he didn't say in that interview was, does that have to happen before there can be this 30-day ceasefire? Or does he say, well, that has to be the end? Because if you just say that, well, all right, sure, we'll address the root causes, let's stop the fighting today for 30 days and start talking about that, because then that's going to say, well, then they may not get to it. I mean, the two sides are miles apart as it is on the root causes, and there's not any agreement at all on any of the sides, whether that's U.S., Ukraine, or the European side and the Russian side. There's no agreement at all on that. So it seems suspiciously unlikely that Russia would go down that path of just saying, yeah, without closing that gap first, we're going to have a negotiated peace. Because you can just say, sure, we'll address the core issues. If the West thinks that the core issues are over here and Russia thinks the core issues are over here, then you see that you're not even close to having a resolution. So one would imagine that Russia would want some kind of assurances that they were maybe this far away, not this far away, or they may not agree to the resolution. I know many people in the Russian press, I've been reading this earlier today to kind of see what the reaction to a lot of this is. They seem to be convinced, they're not, quote, worried that Putin may give things away. They're actually confident that what he's saying is, we're not going to reach a ceasefire unless you be according to the terms that we have set. They said that militarily, Russia is in a position that they have now shown dramatic advances in the Kursk area, especially since the 8th of March, really. They went on this huge run, and they're almost completely have driven Ukraine out of Russian territory. And that's where Putin was when he was in that camouflage uniform yesterday, talking with Gerasimov near the front lines. The people in Russia and the state-approved media, I'm not just talking about telegrams, but in the state-approved media, they are saying, hey, this is just us telling the West what it's going to be. And yeah, we'll have a ceasefire as long as you agree to all of our terms. And that's going to be the demilitarization of Ukraine and the denazification of Ukraine. Those are two super important parts, aside from the physical territory, aside from the June 14 lines I've mentioned several times before, the administrative borders of those areas. They were saying that the Ukraine side must willingly to lay down its arms and withdraw from all the territories before there would be a ceasefire. And specifically in the area of the Kursk, the Russian side is saying you have a simple choice, two choices for all the Ukraine side in there: surrender or die. That's one of the things that's actually coming out of the Kremlin today as well. I think that came directly from Putin. I believe that was actually one of his quotes, not something they're assuming. And so they don't appear, the Russian side doesn't appear at all interested in having a ceasefire when they're literally about to finally close the gap in the Kursk area. And that was actually one of the things also mentioned by Putin in his discussions today was, what about that situation there? Because we're not going to end the fighting and leave that open in, to have allowed them to enter our territory and then right at the end when we're getting ready to close it off, to somehow have them escape. Because one of the other things from the comment yesterday, I want to go ahead and talk about this, that Putin said, this whole issue about the fighters in Kursk, we view them in Russian law, which is a little different than the Geneva Convention.
I very much expect that all combat tasks of our units will certainly be fulfilled and the territory of the Kursk region will soon be completely liberated from the enemy. Our task in the near future, as soon as possible, is to completely defeat the enemy, who is entrenched and still fighting on the territory of the Kursk region, to completely liberate the territory of the Kursk region and restore the situation on the state border. And, of course, I ask you to consider the creation of a security zone along the state border in the future. I would also like to draw attention to this. All those who are on the territory of the Kursk region, who are committing crimes against the civilian population here, who are opposing our armed forces, law enforcement agencies and special services, are terrorists according to the laws of the Russian Federation. Now Valery Vasilevich Gerasimov has just mentioned the prisoners of war. But these people, of course, must be treated first and foremost as terrorists, in accordance with the laws of the Russian Federation.
Now, of course, everybody in the West remembers in the first year of the war when they were trying to negotiate the terms of an end of the fighting in Istanbul in late March, early April of 2022, that there was this shortly after those meetings had adjourned, there was an explosion in the Western media about what they claimed was the discovery of a massacre in a place called Bucha. And the claim was that the Russian soldiers had massacred and executed a lot of civilians, and that just hardened the resolve of the West. It infuriated it, made everybody really angry, and said, what barbaric people the Russians are, etc. So for no way we're going to talk about peace. Forget it. That's not going to happen. We're going to go on until we have victory over the Russians. You may remember that. Now, there's a lot of dispute. The people in the West will say it's been verified, it's been validated. It was war crimes by the Russians, but there are other versions on the other side, and certainly on the Russian side, they believe that it was staged, etc. I'm not going to try to litigate that now. I don't have any firsthand experience. I can't tell you other than that there are two really different viewpoints about what actually happened there. But what I can tell you is that on the Russian side here, then hardly anybody in the West talks about this, and they have not been putting the news out there, though it has been all over the place in the Russian media and especially in the Telegram channels, is that the Russians say that there has been widespread war crimes by the Ukraine side in the Kursk region against their civilian population. And there are a lot of videos that have been out there, a lot of photographs that have been put in there where they say that a lot of old people have been executed, they were tortured, that people were summarily killed. They were just executed civilians, I'm talking about, throughout the Kursk region. Now, like the deal with Bucha, I'm not in a position to be able to say what's true or what's not. What I can tell you is that the Russians believe that it is true. And so that is the reason why Putin was so emphatic to say in that press conference that he is not going to just treat them as prisoners of war under the normal Geneva Conventions, because in his mind, they came onto the territory of Russians and attacked civilian people. Ergo, by their definitions, that is terrorism, and therefore they will be treated as terrorists. Now, that's a big issue because the people of Russia are not going to be very disposed to have a peace settlement that's beneficial to the Ukraine side when they see that their civilian people were massacred, they believe, by the Ukraine side. Now, that is going to be factoring into any kind of an agreement to have a ceasefire, because one of the there's a couple of other things that they're saying is that this ceasefire, one of the questions that Putin had in his press conference today was, he says, before we'll agree to this, we need to see from our American colleagues, and you heard Trump say a second ago that our representatives are there. I believe it's Steve Witkoff. I think he's actually on the ground in Moscow, if I'm not mistaken, right now. But there's definitely conversations going on. And one of the things the Russian side said, before we agree to this, we want to know, how is it going to be monitored? Because the big problem that the Russians have with all this is they said, listen, we're advancing on every front. In the Kursk area, there's still active operations going on north of Kharkiv, and then all along the area, especially in the Kupiansk area, the Toretsk area, and then southern, even in the Kherson area, a lot of operations going on there. Russia, in their view, is advancing on nearly every front. So they're saying, where's the benefit to us to having a ceasefire right now when we're already on the way up? We don't want a ceasefire that's going to result in the other side being able to recuperate, to replace their losses, to continue digging defensive lines. So apparently one of the caveats, the nuances that the Russian side referred to, is that there will be a complete and total freeze of all activity everywhere, so that the Ukraine side will not be allowed to move any ammunition in. They will not be able to resupply stocks. They will not be able to move more people up and to move troops around to reinforce anything like that. It has to be a complete and a total freeze. Now, whether the Russian side will abide by that on their end remains to be seen. But that's one of the things that Putin is saying that they need to have resolved. He said, and how will we validate that these things are going on? Now, one of the things we hear oftentimes in the West is that, well, we can't trust Putin. We can never trust anything he says. But we forget that the same lack of trust exists on the Russian side, because from their perspective, that the West has often broken its word to it, that they have often said one thing and then done something different. So they also are saying, how can we trust the West side? And so Putin was asking, there's going to have to be some sort of validation instrument as part of all this, so that we can validate that Ukraine is not doing the things that we say they can't do if we agree to a truce. Now, that's something that's going to be very complicated, and I don't know how that's going to be resolved anytime soon. And all evidence is that the Russians are going to continue on with their offensive operations. That's one thing that the Russians have said a long time, that the reason why they didn't want a truce was because they wanted to continue fighting, because they wanted to continue going on until there was, an issue that brought to the conclusion the core issues of this, the root causes. And so they said, we're not in any mood to actually stop fighting because we're on the military advantage. And as I've said a whole bunch of times, why would the side that has the power, that has the combat advantage, and therefore can compel and has the diplomatic leverage to impose upon the other side, why would they willingly set that aside? I don't know. Maybe there's some sweeteners that the Trump administration can do. The Witkoff's there. Who knows? Maybe he's saying, okay, I know militarily it's not in your advantage to have a ceasefire, but if we can give you some sweeteners, some of which have been kicked around as possibilities, is all right, we will release some of the money, the frozen assets of the Russians that are in Western banks. We'll remove some of the sanctions that are against Russia in exchange for a ceasefire. We need to understand something. It is possible that there's a ceasefire, even though militarily there's no reason the Russians would do it. But if there can be some sweeteners added, it could be made to be in the interest of the Russian side to do this. I certainly hope that's the case. I'm a big advocate of that. Anything that stops the killing on all sides of this is something I'm super in favor of. But we also have to be sober-minded and understand this won't be cost-free. And the idea that Trump could remove some of the sanctions on Russia, that he could remove some or free up some of the frozen assets, will just explode the heads of many in Europe. because they don't want to give anything. They want to get a ceasefire that benefits the Ukraine side, that disadvantages the Russian side, and they want to pay nothing for it. That's almost certainly not going to happen. There's no rational reason why the Russians would do that when, as they say, they can just ignore the whole thing. They don't have to have a deal. They don't have to have a negotiated settlement. They can just continue the war as is, even if they keep going it slow, even if they don't use any of these so-called big arrow movements where they have a shock and awe kind of a deal like the U.S. has used before, like the Russians did on the first iteration of this war in February of 2022. They haven't done any of those since. Now, I've long been puzzled why they haven't, because according to all we can see, they have the combat power that's not in contact, and they could do it. Thus far, they have chosen not to for their reasons. One of the reasons the Russian side, especially on some of their military channels, is that the Russian headquarters has said they are prioritizing lowering the offensive casualties for the Russian side. And if they calculate if they go slow, that they can inflict a significant number of casualties on the Ukraine side. And over time, even if it takes another year of combat, they think that they will eventually grind the Ukrainian army to dust, and then they'll just simply take over the rest because there won't be anybody left to defend it. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but given what has happened here, there has been a substantial reduction in the effectiveness and the size of the Ukrainian army. So there's certainly some evidence that that is working, even though it's not the Western way, and we certainly wouldn't do it that way. But they prioritize the destruction of the Ukrainian army above taking territory because they calculate they want to minimize their own casualties, and then eventually, by focusing on the force structure, they'll eventually get all the territory anyway without even having to fight for it after that happens. That's their philosophy. We'll see how that plays out. But whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, that is what they are attempting to do. So now you get to the issue of a ceasefire. Is Russia going to have a ceasefire that's going to lead to a negotiated settlement that's going to be less than Putin's June 14 lines? That seems really unlikely. So again, we get to the cost of him agreeing to this. Putin has said he is willing to do this. But aside from these sweeteners that I just mentioned here, it's also going to have to be, apparently, based on what he said, that the West side is going to have to agree that all of the June 14 lines are going to be committed. That means that there's going to be an election in Ukraine, because they won't sign. They've clearly said that, and they haven't changed this at all. They won't sign a final deal unless they have what they consider to be a valid president, somebody who has stood forward and won an election, and they don't see Zelensky's doing that. Zelensky still, to this day, still has a law prohibiting him from negotiating with anything with Russia. So that would have to change as well. They have also said, and this was in the Institute for the Study of War, reported in December, late December, I think it was the 24th, that there was the Russian side at their Duma level, their parliament, had said, listen, we're going to hold something like what was the term they used? Istanbul 2022 plus scenario, meaning that the terms we had there will all be in effect plus some more. And one of the key ones expressly mentioned was the demilitarization of whatever's left in Ukraine, which they calculated at a number of 85,000. That's where that number came from. It was from a Russian Duma person reported by the Institute for the Study of War, going back to the 24th of December of last year. Yeah, that's the one right there that's in there. And you can scroll up and you can probably see that one. So we've not seen anything that would repudiate that. And so Russia would have to have some real big reason to say we're going to go back from that. And listen, again, you have to understand the people in Russia believe they have paid a huge and unnecessary price to have won these things. Now they see they are on the military irrevocable advantage. And if they didn't do any deal at all, if they didn't do any ceasefire at all, then they're eventually going to be able to win at a cost that they can afford, or that they're willing to pay, rather. And they see that the Ukraine side isn't. Now, if they have a chance through negotiations to accomplish their security objectives and not lose any more troops, then they would do that as well. But therein gets to the point, and this is what we don't know. And so far, no one's given us enough information we can see from here. What would the West and Ukraine have to agree to in order for Putin to say, all right, that satisfies my minimum conditions, I will go ahead and agree to a 30-day ceasefire given these conditions? Because it seems likely that those conditions would have to be some kind of public agreement that, yes, it's going to be something close to the June 14 lines. It's going to be all the administrative. There will be an election, and it's going to have to be a demilitarization. The end result is going to be this. If the West doesn't agree to that, then it's really hard for me to understand how they would ever agree to a ceasefire where that's left up in the open, because then the likelihood is that the Ukraine side will do exactly what Putin has feared, which is to rest up and recuperate. And believe me, they need this in the worst way. There's many fighters, not common knowledge in the West, on the Ukraine side that have never had a break. Some of them have actually been fighting since the war started. And many others, as time has gone on and they've been mobilized and they've been put in there, also have not had a break. Obviously, the casualties are monstrous, but some of those who have survived have never had a break, which is, you just cannot imagine the emotional and the moral turmoil that puts on the mind. And they are in desperate need of a relaxation because Russia hasn't given them one anywhere all along the line of contact here. And if Russia is going to remove that pressure, it seems very likely that they're going to have a big give on the Western side before they agree to do that, because that is a huge issue. I saw the other day that Sebastian Gorka said that, anytime there's a ceasefire or a negotiated end, you have to first have a ceasefire. Well, that's definitely not true, because we have seen, just look at the Korean War, for example. I think it was like a year and a half of negotiations before we finally came to the armistice, and there was fighting every single day. It was huge casualties back and forth all along what was then the line of contact. So that's very much something that has happened in the past. And then look at World War II. There was no truce there. There was no ceasefire to negotiate an end. There was just one side militarily defeating the other. And we have to understand that Russia is in the driver's seat. And if they want to press a hard bargain and drive a hard bargain and say, we're not going to submit on these things here and these conditions to even have a ceasefire, they don't have to. Now, I hope Trump is able to get this done. I hope that with his negotiating team, with any kind of other sweeteners they may offer, I absolutely wish them every luck in the world, because that would be great for the people of Ukraine. It would be great for everybody. It would end the killing and give us a chance to have a durable peace. But listen, even if you get a 30-day ceasefire, Russia is not going to agree to something short of their minimum lines. I don't think Putin would be able to stay in power if he agreed to even freezing the conflict along the current line of contact, because that would leave Russian citizens that are, by their constitution, already Russian citizens that are still on the other side of the Ukraine line, and they would not abandon them. That is like a sacrosanct thing for the Russians. They really do believe in what they're saying here about the taking care of the Russian people. There are still what they consider Russian people on the Ukraine side of the line. And I don't see any evidence and don't believe at all that Russia would agree to any kind of a line that leaves what they consider Russians on the Ukraine side of this. And the other, maybe the biggest issue, is this demilitarization issue, and definitely the denazification / need for elections. I just don't see Russia giving in on either one of those two things, because they don't have to. Just imagine, what sense would it make for Russia to have done all they have, to have the advantage they have right now, that if they fight even another 9, 10, 12 months, even if they had to fight another 12 months, they could set the pace for the indefinite history, an indefinite future rather, of security based on their own terms, without having to trust anybody, without having to have a negotiated settlement. They can have that for the security of their country, even if they had to spend another year to do that, as opposed to having a deal that doesn't require the Zelensky government to get out, that doesn't require a demilitarization, and does leave open the possibility of the Western Europe making good on what you saw in our previous show today. Ursula von der Leyen is having a rearmed situation where they want all of Europe to grow stronger, and they want a good portion of that to all go into Ukraine. Those things are mutually incompatible. They cannot both exist. Russia will not have security as it deems necessary if all of those things are not solved. So even if you get a ceasefire, which will be hard, that still is just a 30-day ceasefire. It's not an end of conflict. And if Russia doesn't get its way, there's every reason to think that they may continue on. And listen, Russia would also benefit from a ceasefire. So there's also could be that. Their men could certainly stop dying for 30 days. They could rearm and refit and whatever else, depending on the terms of it. But even if it was just a mutually restrictive situation where nobody could reinforce anything, their troops would benefit from a 30-day respite as well. So it wouldn't be out. But they're not going to seek respite for their troops and a benefit for their men at the expense of the ultimate objective. Putin was very clear on that today. He's been very clear on that from day one, and it's never changed about the ultimate outcomes of these situations here. It doesn't seem to be that the West is getting the message, though. I referenced our earlier show today where you had Ursula von der Leyen said, they're on this rearm situation and they're on a military buildup. Go back and watch that show. I won't relitigate it right now, but the bottom line is they're giving Russia every reason in the world not to trust us, not to want to have a negotiated settlement that leaves a rearming Europe on their doorstep. That almost certainly means that they're going to continue the military buildup they've been on for the last couple of years, especially. So that's not going to help long-term peace anyway. But some in the West, as illustrated here by former CIA director and former SecDev Leon Panetta, has different views.
I've learned after many years of dealing with Putin, both as director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense, that you never can trust Putin, and that Putin is not somebody who responds to pretty please. Mm-hmm. He usually responds to force. And the result is that I really am concerned whether or not Putin will respond positively to the approach of agreeing to some kind of ceasefire. I think the only way he's going to do that is if he is convinced that there is no way for him to win this war. And the only way to convince him is to have the United States strongly back Ukraine in its efforts to defend itself.
That is alarming to me, especially that last part. First of all, let me back up to a little earlier in his comment there. He says, Putin typically only responds to force. Really? Is that what the play you want to make, that Putin can be compelled to something? Where have you seen Russia respond to force? Where have you seen that the West has pressured Russia and that they've done something according to what we want there, that he backed down? Where have you seen that? Because other than when Russia was weak at the beginning, when NATO was expanding and Russia didn't have the capacity to stand up, and for example, the Baltics, when they were brought into NATO, the Russians were opposed to that. They didn't like it, but they didn't have any power to do anything. So now, if you think that that's the template, that's what you mean when you say Russia or Putin specifically responds to force, he didn't have the capacity to do anything then, and that was still on his periphery. Even though it was on his border, there is the Suwalki Gap, a very small territory of land that Russia realizes that they could block in the event that anybody went into hostilities, and it could bottleneck everything. And so it's not that big of a threat. But Ukraine, on the other hand, in NATO would have been a huge issue here. And we had 15 years prior to this war to where we kept trying to press Putin. We kept trying to push him. And he finally said, yeah, I ain't having that anymore. We pushed him too hard in Georgia in 2008. He took action there. Then we pushed too hard in Ukraine all the way, despite all of their protestations in Russia, beside all of his, practically begging to follow the Minsk and then having another negotiated settlement right before. He didn't respond to any of that. So then we say we were going to press up anyway, and he reacted. Now then, they're much stronger even than they were in 2022. And you want to make the argument, former CIA director, former Secretary of Defense, with all your credibility, you want to say that now that Putin can be forced into it? I mean, that's one thing that's bad enough. But then you say toward the end there that we're going to, change the power dynamic so that Russia understands that it can't win. Goodness gracious, you've got to be kidding me. Were you asleep in the year of 2023? Have you slept through the entire 2024 on top of that? Have you not seen the daily reports? Have you not seen the casualty figures on the Ukraine side? Do you not realize that the industrial capacity on the Russian side and on the entire Western side are grossly out of balance and growing in the Russian side to this day? We can't fight an attrition war like that and win. You see, the European side is saying they want this rearm thing, $800 billion, huge number, but spread out over many years, and that'll be a long time in coming. Oblivious to the fact that the Russians are already ahead, and they're definitely not going to just sit passively by. They'll continue to build up, and they'll still have an advantage even in 2030. God forbid if there's any war that could come between them. There's not. The power dynamics are still not in our favor. How can he not get these kinds of things? This is not hard to figure out. If you want peace in Europe, if you want peace between Russia and what's left of Ukraine, if you want to lower the threat of armed conflict and definitely nuclear escalation with Europe and interest in the American side, then you want to de-escalate the situation. No one is even talking about the possibility, other than Donald Trump, of having a negotiated an end. He's the only guy that's actually looking beyond the war to try to improve relations. He's actually seeking negotiated settlement on the nuclear issue to try and lower that temperature there. He wants to get war off the table so that he can begin recovering and having normalized relations that benefit everyone and lower anybody's need to have a conflict in the future. That's the only thing that we should go towards. And yet you have guys like this. You have, of course, Starmer, Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas. All of these people keep talking about ways they only want to solve things with more force, even though there is a huge, I mean, we'll just take the last 24 months of wreckage of these attempts to try and change that on the ground. And it has done nothing but make Europe weaker, has destroyed Ukraine, and made Russia stronger. What do you not get about this? That's not hard to figure out. And yet you're oblivious to this, and you still advocate for doing the same things that failed in the first 3 years of this war. You just want to do more of it. And there's no rational path to get there. I'm grateful that that guy is no longer in office, but, you know, holy cow, they keep putting in the microphone in his face and people keep listening to him. But they don't look at what he's actually happened and what he's suggesting, because it's irrational what he is suggesting. But that's the state of play today. So we'll have to continue to monitor this. I'll be real interested in hearing what comes, what is ever announced after these next level of meetings, because it's going to be really important. Some have suggested they have hopes that this thing could possibly, this 30-day ceasefire could be implemented as soon as a week from now. Obviously, we give our supreme hopes for that. But the devil's in the details. It's going to remain so. It's going to be a heavy lift. So I don't want to get anybody's hopes up that's going to happen, even though we're fully advocating it. But listen, until those issues get resolved, we have to be prepared that Russia may either demand some sweeteners that are beyond what Trump is willing to give, or that his conditions to even start this, which is probably some kind of declaration of demilitarization and a denazification, as they define it, are probably going to be necessary up front, or they're not going to stop fighting. They don't have to. We'll have to see how that goes on. We will definitely stay on top of this for you. We will bring you information as it happens, and we'll take it from there, because we're unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, whatever it is, because that's what you need to make sense of the world around you. And on that point, I know I've seen a lot of comments in some of our recent shows. A lot of our supporters out there have seen a lot of information about me in the press, about some things that have and have not happened in the United States here, especially in regards to the Director of National Intelligence Office, the ODNI. I'm going to have something to say on that shortly. I'm just doing some conversations with some certain people and thinking about some things, actually, more than anything else. But I just want you to know I am going to address what you've been reading about, and look forward to sharing that with you at the appropriate time, possibly as early as tomorrow. But I'm still waiting on some things, and when it's right, I will bring that to you. I promise you. Thank you very much, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.